He'd ridden out with the last of his savings to buy a milk cow, but instead he returned with an Apache woman, one who carried in her eyes the promise of a future neither of them had expected. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The bite of December wasn't just cold, it was cruel, a force that cut straight through skin and bone like a set of hungry teeth. I was Eli Boone, 39 years old, though the years and hardships weighed on me like I was nearer 50. Every ridge of the Wyoming high country was rimmed with ice, jagged against a sky the color of old ash. The wind came down those slopes like a whip, tearing away the little warmth left in the worn-out wool coat I'd been patching for too many winters. My horse Scout trudged beside me as weather-worn and stubborn as his rider, both of us bound toward Black Creek. Most days the stillness of the plains soothed me, but not that morning. That silence felt like it carried the full weight of failure pressing down on my chest. I wasn't out to prosper or trade, I was fighting to keep ruin at bay. Summer had brought drought that left the grass dead and my herd thin. Then came the October blizzard, stealing my two best calves. My hands scarred and thick from decades of laying rail-cutting timber and trying to scrape out a life felt more numb from defeat than from the cold. In the inside pocket of my duster was a roll of bills, my last chance 10 years of hard saving whittled down to this. It was meant for one purpose only, to buy a strong, heavy cow, already bred, a living promise of milk and survival. Without her, the herd I had left wouldn't see February, and I'd watch everything I built turn to bones. Losing the ranch would just echo a loss I had already endured once. My wife Mary Boone and our stillborn son Little Samuel were buried by the creek. Their deaths hadn't only ended my family, they'd ended any joy I once knew. I'd lived like a ghost in that cabin ever since my heart a stone that refused to warm. Love hope, a future shared with someone. Those words felt farther away than the pale winter sun. When I first saw smoke curling up from Black Creek, dread crawled into my gut. I had promised myself to be practical, to stay sharp. This trip was about survival, no room for distractions. The cattle fair was its usual mess of greed. Men in tattered coats shouted through their whiskey-thick voices, breath clouding the frozen air. Fear, sweat, and liquor clung to the place. I tied Scout to a post, gave his nose a pat, and pushed into the pens, studying flanks and ribs with a cold eye. Prices were steep cruelly, so each one driven higher by desperate men. My money suddenly felt like nothing at all. Still, I found her a Guernsey cow, heavy with calf coat, still decent. The price matched my last dollar to the cent. My fingers went for the roll of cash, my heart hammering in my chest, when a sound cut through the noise. Laughter. Not the kind that warms a man, but the kind that chills his blood. The cruel, choking laughter of men who had cornered their prey. My hand froze. At the far end of the square, a knot of drifters and drunkards had circled a wagon. Shackled to its axle were Apache captives, beaten thin and left to the icy wind. I'd seen ugly things in my life, but this was worse. It wasn't about power. It was about humiliation. And that's when I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 23, 24. Even bruised, even filthy from the road, she carried herself with a kind of fire that couldn't be snuffed out. Her black hair tangled around her shoulders, her thin dress torn open at the chest. She hugged herself against the cold, defying the eyes leering at her. Her jaw was set, her gaze fixed hard on the frozen ground, but her pride burned brighter than the torchlight. The auctioneer barked out insults through his whiskey-rotted breath. Too proud for a slave, too thin for a wife. "Who'll take this burden off my hands? $100. The crowd jeered. A drunk grabbed her hair, yanking her head up. Her eyes met mine, then dark, terrified, but unbroken. And something inside me snapped. It wasn't pity. It was fury. pure and searing, the kind that stripped away the last of my self-pity. I had come for a cow. I had come to survive. But as I stared at that young woman, I knew survival wasn't enough if it meant letting this moment pass. The voice of reason roared in my head, "Don't do it, Boone. This will ruin you." But my hand was already in my pocket, pulling out the last of my savings. The wad of bills was hot against my palm, the last ember of hope I had left. $200, I growled the words, tearing from my throat like a saw blade. The square went dead silent. The crowd fell into a hush. The auctioneer's eyes widened, shifting from greedy delight to startled disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, the quiet man's looking to buy himself some trouble. My boots crunched across the frozen mud as I stepped forward, closing the distance to the wagon. Without hesitation, I shoved every last dollar I had, the whole of my future, into that slick, greedy hand. "The deal's done," I said, my voice steady as iron. "Now cut her loose." He thumbed through his bills quick as a rattler shrugged and sliced through the rope binding her wrist. The sharp snap of hemp felt like both an ending and a beginning all at once. The young woman staggered forward, her bare feet slapping the ice-crusted ground. She clutched at the shredded cloth on her body, trembling hard enough that her whole frame shook. Her eyes flicked to the rope, the auctioneer, the jeering mob, and then locked on me. There was no thanks in them. Only confusion, fear, and a silent demand. "What's your price?" I stretched out my hand, scarred and rough from years of labor. She looked at it as if it were a rattlesnake coiled to strike. Swinging into the saddle, I leaned down and offered again. "Come." Just one word, plain and final. After a heartbeat that felt endless, she laid her cold, fragile fingers in mine. A jolt like ice shot through my arm as I pulled her up behind me. The crowd howled. Voices rose in anger and mockery. "Fool," they shouted. "Idiot, sentimental. A man trading his life for a curse." Their noise faded as Scout carried us away. I rode out with no cow. My ranch was as ruined as ever. My grief for Mary Boone and little Samuel still pressed down on me. But for the first time in a decade, my heart cut clear like a frozen river breaking free. I hadn't bought a prize. I'd bought back the right to face myself in the mirror. The emptiness inside me was replaced with something far heavier, the responsibility for the shivering woman clinging to the saddle behind me. The ride home was endless. The north wind bit us raw, and the tension between us buzzed like lightning in the air. I didn't yet know her name, Tala Skyhawk, but her presence was sharp and undeniable, pressed against my back, her body wound tight as a spring ready to lash out. Her chill seeped through my heavy duster. She held the saddle horn in a white-knuckled grip, her shallow breaths brushing against my neck. I knew the thoughts storming her mind. Another master, another humiliation. What does he want from me? I wanted to tell her, "You're safe. I want nothing. I couldn't leave you there." But words felt useless. English would only sound like a threat. So I kept silent, focusing on Scout's hooves pounding the frozen earth and the single necessity reach shelter before night killed us both. The cold was merciless. I cursed myself for not thinking her bare feet on the stirrup, her skin against frozen air. I had freed her from the rope, but not from the winter's teeth. Her shivers rattled her frame and jolted through mine. I thought about stopping striking a fire, but with night falling fast and danger all around, it was suicide. We had to reach the cabin. The land grew darker pines, swallowing the last light of day. Each ridge we crossed made my heart heavier. I was bringing her back to a cabin that was more a grave than a home, a place haunted by Mary Boone and little Samuel. What right did I have to pull her into that emptiness? At last, my valley appeared. The cabin crouched against the foothills, looking smaller and more broken than I'd ever seen it. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, the last of the morning's coals. The cattle huddled in sorrowful lumps of frost. I slid from scout legs, stiff from the long ride, and reached up to help her down. She winced as her frozen feet hit the ground, her grip on the saddle horn tight until I had the reins in hand. She trailed behind me, scanning every shadow, every sound, as if wolves circled unseen, moving like prey born in danger. I stabled Scout, stripped the saddle, gave him water. Then I turned, gesturing toward the cabin door. She followed eyes, never leaving my hands. Inside was the same as always, one small room, cold and crude, despite the smoldering fire. Smoke, wool, and silence. One stove, one rough pine table, 2 mismatched chairs, and one narrow bed with a single quilt. Her gaze locked on that bed, her shoulders hunched, bracing for what she thought must come. I ignored it. I set my rifle by the door, hung my coat on a peg, and moved slow, each motion deliberate, unthreatening. I wasn't a soldier here. I was a man trying to show a terrified guest she was safe. I stoked the fire, coaxing the embers to life-fed water into a pot dropped in beans and a scrap of salt pork. The scent of food, the first real comfort in that frozen room, began to rise. She stood by the door, still shivering, as the adrenaline faded, still fighting the cold that wanted her bones. She was starving, but more than that, she was bracing herself for the bargain she believed was coming. I pulled out one of the chairs at the table, filled a tin bowl with a hearty ladle of beans simmering in pork fat, and slid it across from where I sat down. I didn't utter a word, just gestured toward the food and the empty seat. With a stiffness that looked almost mechanical, she moved forward and perched on the very edge of the chair, her arms still drawn across her torn dress. She picked up the spoon as though it were a blade, taking tiny bites, slow and suspicious. I ate my portion in silence, fixing my eyes on the stove's fire instead of her face. I would not do what other men had done. I would not stare her down, nor rob her of dignity while she filled her belly. The tension in the room shifted just slightly when she realized I wasn't going to snatch the bowl or demand anything. It was the first small victory over her fear. She cleaned the bowl bare, and when I rose to rinse mine, she startled. But then, unexpectedly, she stood, grabbed a cloth, and began drying the utensils with quiet precision. A simple reflex, but it was the first step toward something shared. Her feet caught my eye, then, blue from the cold, cracked and raw from rope and frost. Shame pricked at me. I had freed her from the rope, but not from the winter. I crossed to the old wooden chest by the bed, the one that had sat untouched for years. It was Eli Boone's chest, a shrine to grief I had never dared disturb. I pushed past old canvas shirts, my hand brushing linen that still carried her scent, lavender and starch. Pain cut deep, but necessity spoke louder. I pulled free a pair of thick, hand-knit wool socks. They were mine, patched and worn, but warm. Without a word, I placed them on the quilt at the bed and turned back toward the stove, pouring myself black coffee. Behind me, she stared at the socks, calculating the price I might ask for such a simple mercy. I gave her nothing but stillness. At last, need won over fear. She slid them onto her frozen feet, and a low, unguarded sigh of relief slipped from her lips. It was the most human sound my cabin had heard in a decade. She turned away, ashamed to let me see it, but I gave the faintest nod to myself. A debt paid. Then came the harder truth, sleep. She sat stiff on the bed, waiting for the demand she thought must come. Instead, I spread my cavalry coat on the floor by the table, laid a blanket over it, and made my bed there by the door. Knife and pistol stayed at my side. It wasn't weakness, it was a promise she would not be touched. Her eyes followed every move, sharp as a hawk's. Only when I stretched out on the hard planks did her shoulders ease just a fraction. She drew the quilt around herself, my old socks peeking beneath, and lay down. For the first time since Mary Boone died, another person's breath filled the silence of my cabin. And though the floor was hard as stone, the shift in my chest felt clean, almost holy. Morning came gray and merciless. I was up first, coaxing the stove back to life until the flames roared. Tala Skyhawk's eyes snapped open at once, wary, watchful. I moved the same deliberate way I had the night before, coffee brewing stale bread and salt pork on the table. We ate in silence, the weight of what had passed hanging heavy between us. When I finished, I bundled up scarf tight and gloves pulled on, then gripped the axe stuck in the chopping block outside. Meeting her gaze, I jerked my head toward the door. She followed, shivering in that ragged dress, the wool socks her only shield. The wind struck like a fist, cutting through cloth and skin. I split a log clean with a heavy swing, the shock rattling my body, then held the axe out to her. The tool dwarfed her hands, too heavy for her frame. But I gave no guidance, no help. This wasn't about submission. It was a test, an offering of partnership through labor. She studied me, eyes stormy with confusion, anger, and something else stirring beneath understanding. She was being asked to work, not to submit. Her first swing missed the blade, skittering off the wood and jarring the handle against her palm. She gasped at the shock, but did not let the axe go. Her jaw set hard, the line of it sharp beneath the grime. Adjusting her stance, she copied the memory of my movement and tried again. The steel bit deep, but the log held. She swung a third time, then a fourth, until with a guttural, frustrated grunt, the wood split clean in two, the pieces tumbling into the snow. She stood over them, panting the cold, forgotten, a fierce light of triumph flickering in her dark eyes. It was something magnificent to see. I didn't cheer. I didn't praise. I simply stepped forward, gathered the pieces of wood, and gave her a single firm nod. That was enough, more than enough. It said plainly she was no purchase, but a partner standing beside me in this fight for survival. From then on, Tala Skyhawk learned the chores with startling speed. One demonstration was all she needed: how to feed the horses, how to check the fencing, how to haul freezing water. She watched my hands like a hawk, her eyes sharp and intelligent, soaking up every detail. The wall of language between us was clumsy, but shrinking, replaced by the universal tongue of survival. A pointed finger, a nod, a shared grunt of exhaustion. I began to notice her quiet ingenuity. When the creek froze too thick to chop, she wordlessly scooped clean snow into a bucket, setting it by the stove to melt and spare us a treacherous walk. She was practical, brilliant, essential. Weeks dragged by in bone-deep cold and endless labor, a silence that grew tense, but also bound us closer. We were two animals huddling for warmth, respectful of each other's space, yet joined by the crisis. But her old hide dress was failing, tearing further each day. The neckline gaped, exposing her chest to the brutal air. She hunched constantly, trying to cover herself, a gesture that broke my heart. It was a reflex born of shame, forced on her by men who had stripped her dignity. Every time I saw it, I burned with anger. On the fourth morning, when the cold cracked the cabin walls like rifle fire, I knew I had to act. I went to the chest, my hands trembling. I searched for anything warm, clean, decent. My fingers found something I hadn't touched in nearly 10 years. Mary Boone's old calico shirt, faded blue, worn thin from countless washings, but still sound. The scent of her skin, The memory of her hands mending the collar hit me like a hammer, but Tala Skyhawk's dignity outweighed my ghosts. I chose the living over the dead. I laid the shirt and a strip of old leather for a belt on the table without looking at her, then grabbed my coat and fled into the cold to chop wood, swinging the axe with savage intensity, trying to silence the voice that called it betrayal. When I returned, snow on my boots, the cabin was heavy with heat and a deep, charged quiet. She stood by the stove wearing the shirt. The faded blue calico cinched at her waist by the leather strap covered her completely. The sleeves hung slightly loose on her arms, the neckline buttoned high. The torn dress lay folded on the bed like a shed skin. Her eyes were downcast, her hands resting on the fabric as though bracing for a claim. I refused to stare. I refused to make it a spectacle. I walked to the stove, peeled off my gloves, and stacked the wood as if nothing had changed. My silence was my highest compliment. This is yours. Wear it in peace. When she finally looked up, her dark eyes met mine. The fear was gone, replaced by a powerful relief, a sense of being restored to herself. That night she pulled a scrap of canvas from my supplies and began to mend the torn sleeve of my heavy duster. Her hands were steady and sure, working the needle with quiet focus. She didn't ask permission. She simply contributed, cementing her place with thread and skill. The slow shift between us reached its crest one frozen afternoon. I sat at the table, sharpening my hunting knife, silence full and productive. She stirred the evening stew at the stove, then spoke soft, hesitant, but weighted like a declaration. She had been learning my English words, matching them to my gestures. "Mine too," she said. I paused, lifting my eyes from the whetstone. "Yours too?" I asked quietly. She set the spoon down, walked to the table, pointed to the pot, then my bowl, then laid her hand over her own heart. She repeated mine too, forcing the strange syllables. It wasn't a claim on me. It was a claim on the life we were building. The food, the warmth, the labor. It was no longer charity. It was our shared resource, our shared fight. She was demanding to be seen as an equal stakeholder in this fragile world. I felt the heavy wall I'd built around my heart, the wall of grief, guilt, and solitude finally cracked. Looking at her in Mary Boone's shirt, carrying herself with quiet dignity, I felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. She was telling me, without hesitation, to stop clinging to the graveyard of yesterday and start laying stones for tomorrow. The words of thanks that swelled in my chest got stuck in my throat. They were too small, too weak for the weight of what I felt. So I did not speak. Instead, I rose, walked to the door, and lifted the cavalry coat I'd used as my bedding for weeks. I carried it back and draped it over Tala Skyhawk's shoulders. She stiffened at the gesture, but only for a heartbeat. Then she pulled the wool close, clutching it with a fierce, almost defiant gratitude. That coat was no longer just a garment. It was a promise. It said plainly that her safety, her dignity were under my guard. That night she stood by the bed, waiting. I folded my blanket, set it aside, and lay down on the mattress, pulling back the quilt. She joined me, careful, quiet, keeping a respectful space between us. There was no haste, no rush toward the physical. We were simply two souls who had known too much loneliness, now wrapped in the same quilt, needing the silent assurance of not being alone. As the storm clawed at the cabin walls, her breathing slowed and steadied. To me, it was music, the sound of life echoing in a place that had been a tomb for 10 long years. The weight I carried was no longer grief alone. It was the terrifying, beautiful burden of another life depending on mine. The shift between us from jailer and captive to something far more equal forced me to face a truth I had buried. Tala could not believe I was a man without a past, without scar. One afternoon, with the sun pale and useless in the sky, and the cold so sharp it seemed to freeze even sound, I sat at the table, my thumb running over a carved toy that had never been played with. She was by the fire, tending it with quiet care. "My wife," I finally said, my voice jagged from years of silence. I pointed to the chest in the corner. "Mary Boone. She died here, giving birth." Each word was a stone dropped into the room. 10 years ago. The child did not live. I told her about those 2 years of happiness, fierce and impossible, and the day I dug 2 graves by the creek. I told her about the silence that followed, a silence that had become armor around my heart. Tala Skyhawk turned toward me, her face solemn, heavy with understanding. She offered no empty comfort, no false hope. Instead, she walked to the table, placed her hand gently on the small wooden toy, and whispered in her halting English, "My husband." Hunters came in the dark. Silence. "Mine too." She pressed her hand to her heart and let it fall away in a gesture of emptiness. "I know this place." Her words staggered me. She wasn't just acknowledging my pain, she was laying her own beside it. 2 broken vessels, our cracks fitting together to hold something new. The guilt I'd carried, the belief that finding life with her was a betrayal of Mary Boone, began to ease. I hadn't betrayed the dead, I had chosen to honor the living. "You keep your face toward the grave," she said, her voice quiet but steady as ice breaking on a frozen river. "I keep mine toward the sun." Her hands gripped my shoulders, firm, grounding. "I am Tala, not Mary, not a ghost. I bring the new future." It was the fiercest declaration of love I had ever known. The pain remained a scar, cut deep, but she was teaching me a truth I had refused, that scars don't have to own the whole landscape. Then winter showed its worst face. The heart of the season came down on us with savage force, demanding everything we had. The cold was so brutal, the lantern oil thickened, every breath burned the lungs. Each dawn was the same battle, stoking the stove, shoveling snow from the barn doors, breaking the ice on the waterhole so the cattle could drink. In that grind, Tala proved her steel 10 times over. She bore the exhaustion with a quiet dignity that shamed my grumbling. She had an uncanny sense for the cattle driving the weakest into shelter before they dropped, forcing them to eat when they would have starved. I stopped seeing her as a cost. She became my anchor. When my arms gave out from swinging the axe, she wordlessly took it. When I staggered back from the barn, beard iced over, she was there by the stove, holding out a steaming tin cup with both hands so the warmth would reach me faster. Her presence was a force as vital as food itself. The cabin was no longer a shell against the cold. It became a hogan, a place carved out by 2 wills that refused to break. She taught me Apache words that held the weight of mountains and the cold bite of wind. I would come in from the snow and mutter cold too much, dizzy, and she would understand without another word. I was no longer a widower, locked in silence. I was a man carrying the sober, tense quiet of someone guarding his home, his partner, his future. And when we did find each other in that bed, it wasn't driven by hunger of the flesh. It was the deep, necessary act of 2 people fighting for life, clinging to the warmth of belonging in a world of deadly cold. One evening, I came back from the yard to find Tala Skyhawk by the fire. She had taken the shredded pieces of that old hide dress, the very thing that once marked her shame, and stitched them into sturdy patches for my worn boots, making the leather strong enough to stand against ice and mud. She had turned a symbol of captivity into something that kept me walking. The love that struck me then was heavy, searing. Not the bright, easy warmth I had once known with Mary Boone. This was something harder, forged in hardship, sharpened by survival, an enduring love born out of fire and storm. By the 6th week, the weather broke into a brittle thaw. The pale sun hung weak in the sky, whispering of life beyond winter's grip. But with the thaw came the world I had tried to keep out. I was splitting logs near the barn when I heard it, the arrogant rhythm of a rider approaching his horse's gait, carrying the sound of ownership. I laid the axe down slow and deliberate, my pulse climbing. Tala stepped from the barn, instantly sensing the threat. She wore the blue calico shirt my cavalry coat wrapped tight against her frame. But her eyes flashed with the same fear I had seen the night of the auction. Jed Crow rode in his greasy sneer, cutting through the yard like a knife. He reined in sharply, his gaze roaming over Tala, then the cabin, then the neatly stacked woodpile. Dressed in a heavy sheepskin coat, his look was colder than the wind itself. "Well, well, Boone," he drawled, his tone a low insult against the quiet. He swung down, boots splashing into the thawing ground. "Heard you're still breathing. Heard you traded cow money for a wildcat. Thought you'd have better sense." Tala froze against the barn door, her body rigid with dread. She knew exactly who he was. "She's not a piece of anything, Jed," I said, my voice flat, dangerous, my body already moving to shield her. My hand found the worn handle of the axe. Crow chuckled a dry, mean sound. "Don't get soft, Boone. They all run. They all steal. You'll wake with a knife in your ribs one of these mornings. Look, I'll give you a deal trade goods credit. Let me take her off your hands, no questions asked. You can cut your losses and save yourself." He stepped closer, trying to peer around me, his eyes hungry for her face. Behind me, Tala's breathing came in ragged bursts, but she didn't run. She stayed, her faith planted squarely in me. The rage that had burned in me at Black Creek returned, but now it was sharper, honed to a point. "She is not for sale," I said again, the words like an iron law. "The deal is done. That chapter is closed." Crow scoffed. "You're a damned fool, Boone, an old fool blinded by pity." His eyes narrowed one last time at Tala, reducing her to property in his mind. "It's just a matter of time." I didn't spit words back. I didn't threaten. My silence and my stance spoke louder than any weapon. I held his gaze until the truth settled in his gut. I was no longer the quiet, broken man he remembered. I was a man with something worth guarding. With a curse, Jed Crow mounted up and wheeled his horse around. His parting words cut back over his shoulder. "You made your bed, Boone. Don't come crying when she burns it down." I stood still, listening until the last echo of his hoofbeats faded into the hills. Only then did I turn. Tala sagged against the barn door, drained, her face pale, her dark eyes wide with the shock of having stared her past in the face once more. I stepped to her, laid a steady hand on her shoulder. She flinched, but then leaned into it, the fight ebbing out of her. Her voice came cracked, raw, the word trembling with every ounce of her confusion and pain. Why, she whispered. It wasn't about Crow. It was the deeper question that had chased her whole life. Why me? Why risk everything? What could I possibly be worth? I looked at her, the woman who had carried me through the dead of winter, who had brought fire back to a house of ghosts. Emotion tightened my throat until I could barely breathe. I had no philosophy to give, only the simplest truth I had learned. "Because you're here," I said, my voice steady and final. "And I will not lose you to the cold or to men like him." It was not just a vow, it was existence itself. You are here, and therefore you matter. Your survival is my survival. She searched my face for the lie, for the hidden cost. When she found none, the hard lines of her body softened, shaking not from cold, but from release. She stepped away from the barn's shadow, pressed her head to my chest, and wrapped her arms around me. That night, the truth of our future stood plain. Supper passed in silence, thick with unspoken weight. When the bowls were cleared, I did not spread my blanket on the floor. I waited. Tala rose slowly, walked to the bed, and turned toward me. Her dark eyes held steady calm. Eli. She said my name carried with quiet authority. Tala, I answered. She stood there with my cavalry coat still draped across her shoulders. Her voice was sure. You bought me. You slept on the floor. You gave me the shirt of your wife. You stood between me and the bad man. You said mine too for the food. Tala Skyhawk's breath trembled as her hands clasped tight together. Her voice grew stronger. I am not property. I am a partner. Is this the truth you choose? I rose, crossed the last bit of space between us, and laid my hand gently against the wool of my cavalry coat, draped over her shoulders. It's the only truth, Tala, I told her, my voice steady. The past is buried. The debt is paid. You are not a burden. You are my home. She lifted her face to mine, and this time the kiss we shared wasn't a tentative brush born of fear, it was a complete binding claim. I pulled her into my arms, inhaling the scent of sage and smoke tangled with wool. It was the scent of life itself given back to me. That night there was no cold floor, no fear between us. Only warmth. Only belonging. Two scarred souls finally finding the deep rest that comes from knowing you're no longer alone. Winter still howled, but its killing edge had dulled. We were no longer just enduring, we were building. Our shared language of survival blossomed into something deeper. I taught her words like trust and love. She taught me Apache words, Hogan for home, say, for stone, for strength. The ghosts of Mary Boone and little Samuel still lingered, but they no longer ruled my house. They had become honored ancestors, witnesses instead of jailers. One morning while hauling wood, my shoulder gave out again. Pain roared through me, hot and blinding. Before I could collapse, Tala caught my arm and with a sharp, practiced motion snapped the joint back into place. I howled, but the relief that followed nearly dropped me to my knees. We equal, she said firmly, afterward, pale from the effort, her eyes like black fire. You saved me from men. I save you from the cold. We keep the balance. Her truth was simple, and it was absolute. As the thaw finally crept in muddy water trickling through the yard, I knew it was time. The last of my furs and dried meat had to be traded for seed supplies, and most of all, a milk cow. I buttoned my coat and told her I ride to town. I'll trade the furs. I'll bring back the cow. She braided my beard with steady fingers, a small act of care that burned in my chest. You wear my coat, she said, tapping the shoulder of the cavalry wool. You come back to our hogan. I rode into Black Creek with a fire in my chest. The settlers of Black Creek watched me trade furs and meat for flour coffee seed. Their mutters followed me. Boone wasted his money on a squaw. Boone threw away his chance at survival. I ignored them. They saw a fool. I knew I had won back my life. At Mr. Whitlock's store, I gathered what was needed, and then I paused at the trinket counter. I didn't search for gold or polished jewels. My eyes found something plain and honest, a thick band of unpolished brass, dull but strong, the kind of ring made to last as long as iron nails in a barn. I bought it without hesitation. On my way home, I stopped at the graves by the creek. The earth was sunken, the markers worn. I stood there, in the thawing mud, hat in hand. Mary. I whispered her name, no longer a chain, but a prayer. I came back. I lived. The cow is coming. And I found a partner. Tala. I told the silent earth about her strength, her hands, the way she wore the calico shirt, the way she breathed life into my cabin. Then I lifted my face to the pale rising sun and rode home. Tala was waiting halfway down the trail, bundled in a shawl, her eyes bright against the lingering chill. Together we led a sturdy Hereford cow back into the barn, a living anchor for the life we were building. Inside, I pulled Tala close and took the brass ring from my pocket. The metal felt cool and solid in my hand. "This isn't gold," I said, my voice thick. "It's honest metal. It's strength. It's endurance. It's the truth of what we've built." I slid the band onto her finger, over calloused skin, toughened by labor. "Tala," I declared, trembling with the weight of it, "I spent my survival money on you. You gave up your freedom to stay with me. You are not a purchase. You are my wife. You are the future I never knew I deserved." She studied the ring, then raised it toward the weak sunlight. "It is say," she whispered the Apache word for stone. "It endures. It is stronger than gold." Her arms wrapped around me tight, demanding more than words, and I gave her everything I had, holding her, with a ferocity born of 10 years of emptiness. "We have the cow Eli," she said, at last, pulling back just enough to search my eyes. "But more than that, we have the Hogan. We have love." Her voice was steady, fierce. "That is worth more than 1,000 cows." The winter finally broke, not with thunder, but with a sigh. By late March, the last crust of snow melted from the southern slopes, revealing tender blades of green. The yard turned to mud, thick and sucking, but it smelled like life, fresh, thawed earth and running water instead of death and ice. It smelled like a beginning. The Hereford calf came into the world on a Tuesday morning, wet, clumsy, but brimming with promise born into the sheltering warmth of the barn. I paced like a nervous fool while Tala Skyhawk knelt calmly in the hay, her hands slick with birth, guiding the calf to life with a steady assurance I didn't possess. She murmured soft Apache words to the mother cow, a low chant older than any language I knew, and it carried comfort like a lullaby from another age. When the calf finally stood wobbling on unsteady legs in search of milk, Tala turned her face toward me. Sweat streaked with dirt marked her skin, but her eyes blazed with triumphant fire. "Hogan lives, Eli," she whispered, her word for home, but meaning something greater. That calf was proof of what we had fought for, a living testament to the impossible choice we had made. We had survived not by chance, but by sheer, stubborn will together. The days that followed were swallowed by spring's relentless demands. Tala insisted we redirect the small creek, cutting a new channel to water a patch of land near the cabin. She showed me the methods her people had used to coax life from stubborn earth-dry farming in a way I'd never known. She didn't ask, she expected me to dig alongside her. And I did, trading my old certainty for her wisdom. The settlers of Black Creek, who had called me a fool, kept their distance now, though their shadow lingered. Sometimes, while Tala and I mended the fence line, I'd catch sight of the ridge riders on the high hills, their horses silhouetted against the sky, watching, waiting. They wanted us to fail, for her to run, for me to fall apart, so their prejudice could stand unchallenged. But their judgment was nothing more than background noise. Their world was built on fear and limits. Ours, our Hogan, was built on what we dared to create, messy, imperfect, but real. I often thought back to that moment in Black Creek, the instant I threw away $200, my whole future, for something every man around me called worthless. That money was dust compared to the life I had now. That brass ring on Tala's hand carried more weight than all the cattle in Wyoming. I had paid the price of a cow, but what I truly purchased was redemption. One evening we stood together on the porch, twilight wrapping us in its last chill. Above us, the stars scattered cold and brilliant across the vast Wyoming sky. Tala leaned into me, her head resting against my shoulder. We spoke nothing of fences or planting. Instead, I said softly, "You told me once, keep your face toward the sun." Then I called her Say Stone, enduring strength, the name she had taught me. Her lips curved into a slow, radiant smile that melted the last shadows of winter. "We walk together, Eli," she murmured. "Two roads joining, one path now." I pulled her closer, staring out at the wide sweep of the land. It was still harsh, still unforgiving, but it was ours. The ghosts had quieted, and the sound of Tala Skyhawk's steady breath beside me was all the history I needed. The ranch was still buried in debt, spring planting a gamble, and the world beyond still watching for our ruin. But ruin would not come. Winter had stripped us bare, yet it revealed the iron of who we were. We had chosen not only to endure, but to build. And in that choice, we were already home. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.